Hello and welcome to Man Morning 603. This is the second edition while we have all been quarantined in our homes. My name is Chad Pirotte and my colleague is Joe Heschmeyer, and we both work for an organization called Holy Family School of Faith. A little bit about Man Morning for those of you who have not ever been. We started about a year and a half ago with a handful of men at Nativity Parish in Leawood, Kansas at 6:03 a.m. because we found that was the only convenient time that men could meet, especially those with children. And so here we have been going for a year and a half, and we have roughly anywhere from 60 to 70 guys that show up every morning. And we do topics like this today. So, Joe, why don't you go ahead and start us off?
Okay, well, I'm Joe Heschmeyer. I'm the other person who leads this, and I'll just go ahead and begin. So the topic today, you get a little hint of it maybe from this image. I don't know if you've ever seen this before. I find this image hilarious and accurate. It's the battle between Lent and Carnival. Carnival was like the big Mardi Gras celebration right before Lent. And so it's, and also like Carnival literally means farewell to the flesh. So it was all about just like throughout much of the year, you may find you're a little overindulgent with the flesh. You see the guy with the skewers of chicken, you see the guy with the big mug of ale. And so you have this like maybe giving in too much to the bodily stuff. And then you have Lent represented on the right side with, the monks and the priests and the old lady fighting for kind of austerity and keeping everything a little more in order. This battle, I think, is a battle within every human heart. And I had that in mind because right now, the bishops' conference, or not the bishops, sorry, rather, particular bishops are giving like an indulgence. They're relaxing the whole don't eat meat on Fridays in Lent. They're basically 6 days out of the year, 7 days out of the year that you can't eat meat on. But because of the quarantine, because of all of the stress and the inconvenience of the coronavirus, even that is being relaxed by a lot of bishops. And I think it's coming from a good place. I think they're trying to kind of accommodate people who feel overwhelmed, feel taxed, and everything else. But I think ultimately, it's kind of a problematic idea. So the theme of today is why your Lent should be harder rather than easier. Anything you want to add so far, Chad?
Well, so it's interesting. I just learned this today or yesterday. I can't remember. But the word quarantine, do you know where the word quarantine comes from? It actually means
it comes from.
It means 40.
Yep.
And it was basically a set aside 40-day time where you would quarantine yourself if you were sick or had some plague, I imagine. And so it's very, very appropriate, perhaps, that we are in a 40-day Lent, which is also a quarantine. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, I think it's a great example. If you were a traveler arriving in the city of Venice, I believe it was, they would make all foreigners wait 40 days to make sure they didn't have any diseases that were just latent or dormant, and then they would let them into the city. And so literally it is the same Latin word that gives us the word used in Spanish and Italian and even in Old English for Lent. So it's a great example of that this quarantine should be Lenten. And I think it also shows us something about how we've maybe gotten away from it by the fact that we think, well, being stuck in our homes in a first world country with Wi-Fi, with video conferencing, with DoorDash, and everything else is just like this terrible burden. When you compare it to not just most of the rest of the world, but even most of the rest of history, what Lent looked like, this is still an embarrassingly easy Lent. A friend of mine called, and she was very upset that like Western Catholics were complaining about this because she had been talking to someone who hadn't been able to go to a Catholic church in like a month just because they lived in a country where Catholicism was virtually illegal. And it was not because it was Lent. It was not because of a pandemic. It was just life is hard, and you either get used to it or you kind of complain about it and see if you can relax it. Now, a few other things to notice. First is, as of Sunday, We are officially in what was called Passiontide. Now, this is from a joint Catholic Pentecostal document that's explaining a little bit about the history of what it looked like to become a Christian. And they're talking about how if you read the writings, especially between like the year 300 and the year 400, there are a lot of texts that we still have that were written to people who were in this intense period of preparation to become Christian. And in the last few weeks before Easter, especially, they're going to specify later in the document, the last 2 weeks, there was a real intense period of preparation. Like they increased the intensity as we got closer and closer to Good Friday, to Holy Saturday, to Easter Sunday. And so this intensity was expected, even of those who weren't baptized yet, even of those who weren't Christians yet, just to prepare for this. Like, it's kind of like the cramming before the finals period. And so Passiontide doesn't just exist for people about to become Christians, but it's connected to that whole history. So Prosper Geringer, who is the grandfather of the liturgical movement, talks about this. He said the severity of the Lenten fast is increased during its last days. He's talking here about Passiontide, the last 2 weeks. The whole energy of the spirit of penance is now brought out. In other words, rather than this is a time to slack off, it was no, now you're in the home stretch. Now, like maybe if you're running a marathon, you pace yourself for the first, whatever, 3/4, or I obviously have never run a marathon, but you get the idea. Like you pace yourself in the beginning, but as you're in the home stretch, you don't have any reason to pace yourself anymore. So you go all out. And he gives this reason. He says the church wouldn't want her children to come to the great day of the immolation of the Lamb, to come to Good Friday, without having been prepared for it by compassionating with him and the sufferings he endured in their stead. Like you need to get your heart ready for Good Friday so you can enter into that. We often talk about like preparing our hearts to enter into Easter Sunday, and that's important. We also need to prepare our hearts to enter into Good Friday. Pope John the 23rd talked about this. This is at the beginning of the Second Vatican Council. He talked about how these last 2 weeks of Lent mark the beginning of the Passion, and they prepare us for an intense encounter with the mysteries of that most moving and salutary sacred liturgy. Again, we have to prepare for Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and for Easter Sunday. And he says one of the ways we do this is where you get the veiling of the images of the crucifix, of images of Mary and of the saints. So some churches do this. It depends on where you are. But in the U.S., this is still done. We're in the 2 weeks before Easter. Churches will often cover up all of the images and all of the statues. And it's one way of inviting us, he says, into an intimate gathering and sacred communication with the Lord through prayer and a meditation that should be assiduous and ardent. Okay, there's one more thing I want to share, because some people are going to hear this and say, yeah, but didn't Vatican II get rid of Passiontide? Or wasn't this done away with in the Novus Ordo Mass? So it wasn't actually done away with in Vatican II, but after Vatican II, a special period called Passiontide was taken off of the calendar. But there's still a remnant of this. So the veiling thing Pope John the 23rd was talking about is still permitted in the U.S. Explicitly in the general instruction. And the reason for it is this. So there's a book called the Sacristy Manual that sort of explains why we do some of the things we do. And so this guy, the guy who wrote it, Thomas Ryan, says that it's a practice that is a fast for the eyes, not unlike the fast from food that we observe during Lent, and the fast of the ears that we receive in the reduction of the use of the organ. So in Lent, you may have noticed the liturgy is a lot sparser. There's a lot less music. The music that there is often just chant or very simple. And there's this whole simplification that happens. And it's to reflect the simplification that should be going on in our lives. I know it was a lot, kind of a deluge. But my point here is that even if it weren't for coronavirus, and we'll get into the plague stuff in a second, even if it weren't for that, the mere fact that we're in the last 2 weeks of Lent should be a signal to us this is a time to really step up our game because this is the time that we're really preparing to enter into the most sacred season in the life of the church. Okay, Chad, anything you want to add? Anything you want to say in response to that?
No, I mean, nothing other than just simple logic and common sense that when we abstain from food and cause more passion, more sacrifice, it makes the celebration better. Period.
Absolutely.
And so what I have found, and I'm not the best at this in any way, shape, or form, but what I have found is that when we do live out the season of Lent well, then the season of Easter is also lived out well. And there's something profound about not just scripturally or entering into the story of the gospel, but also entering into it with every aspect of our sensories, which, would include the veiling of the statues and the removal of not eating and everything else. So I just think there's some prudence in this that has been thought through for a couple thousand years.
Yeah, amen to that. And I mean, you can see this at just a very human level. The example I always like to use is like when you go to a steakhouse, if you fill up on breadsticks and aren't hungry for steak, like you really blew it. And you really have to learn like a little bit of self-restraint, even to enjoy bodily passions the way you should. Like imagine trying to live at Disneyland. It would, maybe it's fun to visit for a day or a few days, but if you just were there day after day after day after day, I bet it would get nightmarish pretty quickly. I bet you'd get bored of it pretty quickly. And I bet you'd want to go home because the human heart isn't made to just be in constantly a state of feasting. Bishop Barron had a commentary on the Beatitudes where he was saying, with blessed are those who mourn. Another way to understand that is you're really blessed if you don't feel addicted to good feelings. If you don't feel addicted to always being on an emotional high. And so much of the culture says you have to be happy and sated and pleased and taken care of at every moment of every day. And anyone who lives like that finds really quickly it's just awful. I mean, take the experience of having had too much sugar, where it goes from being like a really pleasant experience to really like leaving a bad taste in your mouth and you just feel gross. It's like that with all pleasure, really. Like if you can't enjoy these things in moderation, and that includes having times where you just say no to anything for a while, that's part of moderation, right? Like fasting is part of moderation with feasting. You can't just have normal and feast. You need fasting, normal, and feasting to really balance it out. If you can't do that, you can't enjoy even bodily pleasures in the way that you're meant to enjoy them. So it isn't just like you're denying yourself the joy of heaven. It's like you're denying yourself in a real way the joys of earth.
Yeah. So one situation that we've talked about before in another setting, but when I was teaching at a school, one of the teachers came up to me afterwards and he just said, something you said struck me. I want you to imagine going back about 150 years to, prior 1860s, 1870s. And this was an era where we had no radio, we had no TV, we had no music, live music. I mean, we had no music unless it was live, okay? And so, and really even like there was no print to the extent that we can have posters of masterpieces in our living room. People didn't have that. And so when you go to church on a Sunday, it's most likely the first time that entire week when you're encountering song, when you're encountering incense, when you're encountering paintings, when you're encountering live music, organ, piano, and it makes it a heavenly place that you actually want to be at. Whereas now it's almost interesting. It's kind of there's kind of this stereotype of, oh, the mass is so boring. And potentially it's boring because we have been so oversaturated with sensory overload every single day through whatever it is that we're participating in. I don't know.
I think that's brilliant. I honestly think that's a great insight. And I think even, so a second ago, here, I'll share it again. There's the line about kind of restricting the organ music. So let me go back. The reduction of the use of the organ is one of the ways of marking the fast during Lent. Well, if that's all the music you're hearing all week, or virtually all the music you're hearing all week, then that is a real fast. But on the other hand, if it's like you're listening to your jams that you're personally curating, that's, an algorithm is created to cater just to your tastes, and then you go from that to like hearing an amateur choir sing on Sunday. Yeah, I think I don't think it's quite the same penance to not hear that, because that's a great answer. Okay.
Well, no. Go ahead. I was just gonna say, actually, I was just gonna ask one question. It doesn't have to be answered.
Yeah.
But just a question of reflection for our viewers is, if that's the case, and again, we're in 2020, we're not in 1850, but still, what can we do in our day-to-day life to consume less and to be able to really appreciate the Mass, the liturgy, and the subtleties of it? And I don't know what that looks like for everyone, but I know what that looks like for me, and I think that that's just being very, very intentional to cut out some things so that in the midst of this oversaturated sugar diet, maybe a vegetable that I have can actually taste good. That's all.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think, I hope people watching this are thinking about exactly that. What are the changes maybe for life I could be making? And what are the changes for the next 2 weeks? Because maybe you go pretty strict and you say, maybe for the next 2 weeks, I don't listen to any music voluntarily. Anything I listen to is something I'm overhearing, since you're quarantined, you're probably not overhearing it in the restaurant or anything like that. Maybe you're hearing it just, in your home because your kids are playing some obnoxious music or whatever. You can really have a kind of penance, even from kind of setting the atmosphere around you to your ears as much as to, your taste buds or anything else. But yeah, that's a great insight. The second reason I think it's worth making Lent harder rather than easier right now is precisely that we're in the midst of a real trial with a pandemic. We haven't seen much in the way of disease and pestilence in the modern world in most of our lifetimes. And so we don't really know how to react. But I'm struck by the fact that the Diocese of Rome reacted really differently than the U.S. bishops who relaxed the fast with meat. Now, again, not every U.S. bishop did that. And I think the ones who did it are motivated by a good intention, and they know their people, so maybe they're making the right decision. I'm just struck by the fact that in Rome, when they announced that they weren't going to be able to have public masses, they called a day of prayer and fasting to pray for the elimination of this disease. In other words, they increased fasting rather than decreasing it. This is very much the historic Christian response to disease, to pestilence, to everything else. It's pray more, fast more, tithe more in the face of this trial, because you're entering into a time of trial and you could die any day. So this is a time to really try your hardest, because you might be going to meet God tomorrow, even more than that's always true. So in the early church, one of the worst plagues is known today as the plague of Cyprian. It hit the Roman Empire during the lifetime of Saint Cyprian of Carthage, who is a North African bishop, and he preached on it. And there's a treatise that he wrote about it that he just sent out, that I think is really helpful, because he basically was just calling Christians to arms in the face of this time of trial. So the first thing he says is, well, if the Christian knows and keeps fast, under what condition and what law he has believed. In other words, if you're already doing what you should be as a Christian, then you already know you're going to suffer more than other people in the world, because you're going to suffer more from the attacks of the devil. The devil doesn't want you to be a saint. So if you're someone who takes being a saint seriously, you're opening yourself up to being harassed by the devil. If he already has you, he's not going to harass you unnecessarily if it means he's going to lose you. But if he's losing you, or if he's already lost you, by all means, he's going to try to harass you. Like, he goes after Job. He doesn't go after, like, a really unholy guy. And so Cyprian quotes a couple passages from Scripture. When you come to the service of God, stand in righteousness and fear, prepare your soul for temptation, and then again, in pain endure, and in your humility have patience. For gold and silver is tried in the fire, but acceptable men in the furnace of humiliation. That's from Sirach. And I start there, because he's saying Christianity was never meant to be easy. The mistake we're making today is that for too long, Christianity's been easy, and we expect it to be easy. And the minute it's hard, we whine and say, this is too hard. I should get some breaks. And then we start saying, why me, God? Why is this happening to me? Now, in saying this, I don't mean to be insensitive. I know it could sound insensitive to people who are, maybe they've lost their job right now, or maybe they've even, like, they're worried about disease, or they've lost a loved one, or who knows. Like, they're real things. Those are terrible sufferings. I'm not downplaying that at all. I am saying that suffering and that hardship was something we should have known was coming. And it's only because for so long we've been so comfortable that we sort of lost sight of that. So now we're being reminded of that. So Cyprian goes on to say that the fear and faith of God ought to make us prepared for everything. So if we lose our home, if we are harassed in our limbs by agonizing disorders, if you're very sick, if you're torn by the deadly and mournful wrench from your wife and your kids and from your loved ones, let none of these things be offenses to you, but instead, let them be battles. Instead of letting them weaken or break your faith, let them be opportunities where we show our strength in the struggle, since all of the injury inflicted by the present troubles is to be despised in the assurance of future blessings. As bad as the current moment is, it's a passing moment, and we have the promise of immortality. Okay, before I say anything else, I want to hear what you got to say, Chad.
Well, I think so. This makes me think of a lot of things. The first thing that came to mind was Hebrews chapter 12. He's talking about the context of discipline. I'm just going to read this. Verse 11, at the time, all discipline seems a cause not for joy, but for pain. Yet later it brings the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who are trained by it. So strengthen your drooping hands and your weak knees, make straight paths for your feet, that what is lame may not be dislocated but healed. And obviously there's a certain context there, and I don't want to take that out of context, but actually Hebrews, the letter of Hebrews, is written to people who were undergoing persecution. And so it is this time of just like, hey man, buck up. This is what Christianity is all about. The other thing that I think about, when I lost my first wife, I went through a pretty intense grieving process. And then when I was converting to Catholicism, I came across this article written by an evangelical about evangelicals who convert to Catholicism. And one of the things that he wrote about, which was stereotypical in these conversions, was a person undergoes some type of trauma. And in that trauma, they have to begin, or they feel this sense of needing to connect to people that have gone through some type of trauma like them before them. So there's this connection to the heritage of the saints, which is interesting in Hebrews 12, verse 1. Therefore, since we have this great heritage of saints who have gone before us and who have lived this really radical, hard life, we can be encouraged by that. And so in these times, as a history major, as a theologian, as a Catholic. In these times, man, it just makes me be able to connect with the generations that have gone before us and have lived our faith before us. And they've done it without the joys and the luxuries that we've lived it. And it allows me to kind of connect with the church, to connect with the saints in a way that I've never, ever connected. And so the last thing to say is this: we live in an age where we think that science and technology and medicine can handle everything. And what we're seeing is that no, it can't. And in fact, it doesn't take very long for something to permeate throughout the entire world and kill thousands of people. And it's like, man, welcome to the world, people. This is the reality of the fear that I'm seeing every single day from this virus. Is it's astonishing. Honestly, it's astonishing. And like you said, I don't want to downplay any of the suffering that people have gone through. But it's astonishing to me to see the rapid escalation of chaos.
Yeah, well said. So there's a lot of things to respond to there. I'm going to start last thing first. The thing you just said about how we've made kind of a false god of science and technology, that it can save us from our hardship. And we're seeing now that that's not the case. Now, I don't know who has seen or listened to the Pope's recent blessing on Friday. He gave what's called an Urbi et Orbi, which was a blessing given to the city of Rome and to the entire world. It's usually given just at a papal election, Christmas, and Easter. So it's very rarely given. But he gave a special one for the world because he felt like we needed to be blessed. And he gave a beautiful homily connected to this. He was preaching on the stormy sea in the Gospel of Mark when the disciples are panicking and Jesus is asleep in the boat. And they're saying, "Lord, why are you asleep?" And kind of the comfort with which Jesus can rest amidst this versus the disciples' panic. And anyway, when he's preaching on this, he talks about how the storm that we're currently facing is laying bare all of the places we had put our trust that we shouldn't have put our trust in the first place. That doesn't mean science is bad. It doesn't mean comforts are bad. It doesn't mean technology is bad. It just means none of those things belong in the place of God. And so if we've got them in the place of God, if they're the reasons that we feel safe, rather than God being the reason we feel safe, we're vulnerable because something can happen. And as we've seen very quickly, overwhelm these Western medical systems. Something can happen very quickly and overwhelm, civil society as we know it. So if that's where we're putting our trust, if that's where we're putting our faith, we're in a bad spot, and it's just a matter of time. The other thing you said that I think is really worth responding to is Hebrews 12. Yeah, this notion. So I think this is the key to not misunderstanding what you and I are saying here, because in Hebrews, it's very clear, the reason this discipline happens is to train you as sons, because it's the sons who are put through a more rigorous trial. If you have a business and one of your employees is the person you plan to leave the business to, you're probably going to make sure they know the business in and out, and you're going to push them harder than you push everybody else. The same thing is true in the spiritual life. If you're a saint, if you're promised the inheritance of heaven, God is going to push you harder, not because he's mad at you, but because he loves you, because he's preparing you for something more. So in the same way that, if you knew that there was a war going on, you probably wouldn't say, this would be a good time to make boot camp easier. You would probably say, no, let's really make sure we're getting our butts kicked now, because the alternative is way worse when you go out there in the world. And that is the key to understanding the whole thing about the church's whole emphasis on fasting, on prayer, on all these spiritual disciplines. This is not just punishing myself. This is not even just I want to lose some weight and this is an easy way to do it. No, this is spiritual boot camp. And if you want to see the way this looks, precisely in those times and places in which we took this seriously, Christianity thrived even under terrible persecution. And precisely in those areas where we got lazy and complacent, Christianity fell apart and it just got overwhelmed and it got walked over.
Mm.
I'm reminded. So I used to live in DC, and I think I may have told you this story on a podcast recently. So apologies for anyone hearing this twice, but I found myself repeatedly in a situation where I was talking with cab drivers in DC who were from Ethiopia, who would tell me about the Lent they went through, which was like vegan and like 55 days long. And it made me think, like, this is why when the rest of North Africa fell and became Muslim, this little Christian enclave held on, because they were so serious and have been so serious for their entire history. And that's the normal Christian response to these times of trial. I was reading earlier, kind of preparing for this, about these little 24-hour churches that they would build in Russia. In other words, there was this tradition when a plague would come to gather everyone together and build a wooden church in 24 hours. And there are like 93 of these churches still left standing from just times when plagues would hit. Everyone would come together. They'd build a church in honor of God, and as a way of, asking him basically to spare them from the ravages. In other words, we pray more, we fast more, and we go harder rather than easier when we know that there's a war going on.
Yeah, there's one anecdote that I've heard. It would need to be fact checked. I'm not sure I'm not sure how accurate it is, but there was, back in World War II, prior to World War II, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was a Lutheran, wanted to basically create a seminary that was like a very intense monastic experience. And an interviewer came out to talk to them, and they said, isn't this cultish? What are you doing? Do you really think that this is going to catch on? Like, why would Christians want to be intense in such a way as this? And he actually took the journalist over the hill, and on the other side of the hill was this Nazi training camp. And he showed them this Nazi training camp and all the drills that they were doing, and they just watched for a little bit. And he said, "Do you see how intense the enemy is?" He said, "If we want to succeed as Christians, we have to have more zeal than the enemy." And it's just a powerful image that stays with me. And I think that that's true about Lent.
There's the parable of the unjust steward. The one. So for those who may not remember it, I'm going to heavily paraphrase it. The owner is firing the guy working for him. And the guy working for him, he says, "I'm too old to dig ditches, and I don't want to do that. I'm too old basically to start a new job." So what he does is he cuts a bunch of deals with his boss's creditors or debtors, like cutting them sweet deals so that then he can kind of manipulate a cushy job when he gets fired. Like, he's gotten his 2 weeks notice, so he just he negotiates a golden parachute for himself. And nothing in this appears virtuous at all. At the end of it, Christ is like, "Well, look, if the children of this age have this kind of wisdom, what the heck are you guys doing? You need to be as wise as serpents as well as innocent as doves." And I think it's exactly the Bonhoeffer example, that no, if the enemy is putting in this much work, if people, think about movies like Ocean's 11. We like these, we'll go to any great length to come up with the perfect scheme to get rich, legal or illegal. If you put half that time and energy into being a saint, you'd be the most incredible saint. But we put way more time and effort into making sure we're comfortable or making sure we're successful by worldly standards. So yeah, I think that's exactly what they do. So I think the seminary you were describing is Finkenwald, and Bonhoeffer said the next generation of pastors these days ought to be trained entirely in church monastic schools where pure doctrine, the Sermon on the Mount, and worship are taken seriously, none of which are at the university and cannot be under the present circumstances. So he wanted a generation of just like Christian super soldiers, basically, because he saw how dark things were. And I think that's exactly the right impulse. Like, this is a time to really go into overdrive, to let this be a real time where we take the battle seriously. Okay, with that in mind, I want to get back to St. Cyprian. Because he says, unless the battle has proceeded, there cannot be a victory. When there shall have been in the onset of battle the victory, then also the crown is given to the victors. The helmsman is recognized in the tempest, the soldier is proven in warfare. So you only have the great heroes through the battle. Like the only reason you get, Hebrews 12 is because of Hebrews 11, which is all about the trials they go through and how they live by faith. So if you want to be a great saint, you want trial, you want suffering, you want to go through this period of purification, because without this battle, you never arrive at victory. So it's something we should, in some ways, say, okay, we're ready, bring it on. That doesn't mean we of course, it doesn't mean we think disease is good. It just means we recognize that God permits it because he loves us and wants to bring good out even of these terrible situations. But then he points out another thing, which is this. We don't have a reason to panic and freak out the way someone who's not in a state of grace does. Like if you're not living right, then this should be a terrifying time to you because you're about to go to hell. If you are living right, then you should have an unshaken mind and a grandeur of spirit because you're being promised heaven. And so he says, what a grandeur of spirit it is to struggle with all the powers of an unshaken mind against so many onsets of devastation and death. What sublimity to stand erect amid the desolation of the human race, and not to lie prostrate with those who have no hope in God, but rather to rejoice and to embrace the benefit of the occasion. That in thus bravely showing forth our faith, and by suffering endured, going forward to Christ by the narrow way that Christ trod, we may receive the reward of his life and faith according to his own judgment. In other words, if Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones are both in the midst of the coronavirus, and Smith has no relationship with God, and Jones has a living active faith, Smith lies down in desolation because what else can he do? He's built all of his hopes on worldly desires, on worldly security. All of that has been stripped away and he has nothing left. Jones, on the other hand, shouldn't be lying there next to him in desolation. He should be standing tall because he's been preparing his whole life for this moment. And now he has a chance to really live by faith when it's not just super easy. And to really struggle against the forces of death, all the temptations, all the terrors the world can throw at you, all the terrors the devil can throw at you. In the face of all that, he knows he's walking the way Christ walked, and Christ is there with him. And he's going towards Christ. In other words, they should react differently. So this is a time for Christians really to stand up, really to not just fall into the panic and the obsessive fear that is the hallmark of our modern culture, but rather to go in a different direction. But there's a final reason. And he says this, basically, this is a time Christianity doesn't just survive, but actually grows because all the lukewarm people now realize they have to choose. Are you going to go on the side of Smith or on the side of Jones? Are you going to go on the side of the person who lies down and has no hope, or are you going to stand up with the saints? And what's more, those of us who, as Christians, maybe have ignored the fact that we're mortals who are going to die and be judged, who've maybe gotten too much into the spirit of the present age, we have a new opportunity. We're reminded of our death, and we're kind of reminded again that we have a choice to make. So he says this: by the dread of the mortality and of the time, the lukewarm are inflamed, the slack are nerved up, the slothful are stimulated, the deserters are compelled to return, the heathens are constrained to believe, the ancient congregation of the faithful is called to rest, the new and abundant army is gathered to the battle with a braver vigor, to fight without fear of death, when the battle shall come, because it comes to the warfare in the time of the mortality. In other words, in the time of the plague. That's another way of saying the plague and mortality were the same word. So this is a time when, as Christians, rather than panicking, we stand up, and this is our moment. And when we do this, the people around us who are maybe lukewarm, they'll see that, they'll respond to that, they'll want what we've got, that hope and that joy, rather than what the world has to offer, which is 24-hour news cycle of please be scared, panic, here's some more bad news. All right, Chad, what you got?
Well, I mean, there's been a couple of questions that I've been pondering over. The first is I'm curious to see whenever this quarantine is lifted, and even like a month after it's lifted, when the fear dies down, how many people will be at church? Because essentially that lukewarm question is the question I have. How many people are not going to church on Sunday and they're saying, you know what, this is actually not that bad. I think I could get used to not going to church on Sunday. I mean, it's so much work to get the kids ready. It's just, and is it even worth it? We're not even listening to the homily because of all this stuff going on in the pew. And so that's one question. Or is it going to be the opposite? Perhaps there are going to be people who will really, really miss the Mass and will question their mortality or ponder their mortality and begin to take things seriously again. So that's one question. And this is going to sound crazy. I'm sure there's going to be backlash about this question. But the other question is, what should we be praying for? I'm looking at this quote, and it's in times of hardship when the church begins to grow. And my question is just, obviously it's evil, the sickness, it's not God's will, but at the same time, it's like, if it ended tomorrow, I don't think people's lives would be changed all that much. There would be some for sure, but I don't think it would change very many. In fact, I think everybody would go back to whatever they were doing before and wouldn't even think anything of it. And so I don't know what the prayer request should be. Should it be for the quarantine to end and for everyone to be healthy, or should it be for God's kingdom to come? And that's all. What does it mean to pray for God's kingdom to come during this time rather than to pray for the quarantine or the coronavirus to end?
I think if I were to answer that, I would look at the gospel from this past Sunday, where you have the death of Lazarus. So
yes,
the friends of Lazarus come to Jesus and say he's sick. And it says because Jesus loved him, he waited 2 days. There's a few things going on there. When he gets to the tomb, Lazarus has actually been dead for 4 days. So even if he dropped everything, it seems that he would have gotten there after his death. But he makes this clear to the disciples, because he loves them, he's going to let them stay in the tomb for a couple days and let them kind of experience his death and to know he's really dead and not just asleep. And all of this will be for the glory of God. But that sounds terrible. Like, if you're not,
it does sound terrible.
It sounds like God is just this weird egoist who wants all the credit. So he's going to let you totally screw everything up so he can come in and take all the credit. That's a misunderstanding of what's meant by God's glory. If you want to see what God's glory means in John 11, which is where this gospel comes from, the end of it says several people come to believe in Christ because they see Jesus come and raise Lazarus from the dead. Now, the two things that have to be kept in mind are that as God, he is capable of raising Lazarus from the dead. He's capable of preventing him from dying in the first place. All of this timing totally within his hands. And he allows him to die for his glory, meaning concretely here the conversion of those kind of around this group of friends in Bethany. As a man, Jesus still weeps at his tomb. And so it's healthy, it's good to say this situation sucks right now. If you don't feel that, if it's just like an abstract thing where it's like, well, mathematically this can be good for us, no, like that's not, I think, the way to go about it at all. I think the way to go about it is to both recognize this is a bad situation that we want to end, and we really want good to come from this. That doesn't, like, God is powerful enough to bring good from it right now. And so St. Paul in 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 13, has the famous line where he says, don't, like, we do not want you to be informed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve of others who have no hope. In other words, it's okay to grieve, but don't grieve in like a despairing, hopeless sort of way. So, like, if you're at risk of losing your job, or you have lost your job, or if you're at risk of losing your health or the health of a family member, or you have lost family members, it is okay, it is healthy, it is human to say, that's a bad thing, and I mourn it and I grieve it. But you don't lose your hope in the meantime. Now, the other thing you said, Chad, was you were talking about kind of the church bump. And I think it'll be very interesting to see which of the two ways that it goes. Like, will people just say, not having church on Sunday was great, or I found I could just, live stream some Christian stuff and I felt just as good? Or will it really awaken in people a hunger for the Eucharist and a hunger for the gathering together of the Christian faithful? The only thing I know in terms of numbers are the 9/11 stats, which is that Christianity experienced a spike in church attendance immediately after, but that it wasn't long-lasting.
Yeah.
So, Timothy Keller, a Protestant that I think we both respect a lot, in Redeemer in New York, their ordinary congregation size was 2,600 on a given, or 2,800 on a given Sunday, and after 9/11, it went up to 5,400. So nearly doubled in size, very nearly doubled in size. But that didn't last. So it'll be interesting with something longer lasting like this, where people can't go to church for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. Does it increase the hunger, or does it just kind of wean them off of church, so to speak? I don't know.
Yeah.
Answer to that.
Yeah, I don't know either. I think the interesting comment, first of all, there's this there's a section of the Catechism in the 300s on providence and the scandal of the evil, and he talks about the question of evil. If God the Father Almighty, the creator of the ordered and good world, cares for all of his creatures, why does the evil exist? And he talks about this thing, and then there's this quote from, I believe, Augustine. 1:7, yes, it is Saint Augustine, and he says, "For Almighty God, because he is supremely good, would never allow any evil whatsoever to exist in his works, if he were not so all-powerful and good as to cause good to emerge from evil itself." And so all that to say, I don't know what the end result of this will be. I do pray for God's kingdom to come through this. But I pray that as many people as possible might be saved from this sickness. That's all I can say. But regarding the attendance spike in Manhattan, New York, one of the aspects of that was it was so visible, and it was like this huge event. And it changed. I mean, I know where I was. Everybody who was alive at the time and older than 4 knows where they were when they heard about 9/11 for the first time. And particularly in Manhattan, in fact, it's kind of, I don't know if that's troubling or not, that it only doubled in Manhattan. But that doesn't say much, really, that it only doubled. In the one area where that was impacted, front and center the most. So I don't know. I'm not trying to be pessimistic at all, but I am pessimistic by my nature for those who know me, and that's just where I'm at. So.
Well, I've got a different direction to go with it then, because I think you're right. Like we can't predict what's going to happen. We can help influence what's going to happen. Meaning this, like, we have the decision. I don't just mean like the Catholic Church or the bishops, I mean you and me and every single person watching this has a decision today to decide, am I going to go easier on my Lent, or am I going to go harder? Am I going to pray more, or am I going to say, you know what, you deserve it. You've been through a lot. Relax, take it easy. That relax, take it easy, like mentality, is one that Jesus warns against a lot. You know, the line "eat, drink, and be merry" is one that he coins in a condemning way, like as the attitude not to take. And I feel like this has been the mantra of a lot of our quarantines. Well, okay, you know, you can work from home, eat, drink, and be merry. Might as well relax, pick up, have a good time, sleep in, take it easy. You don't have anywhere to go. You don't have a commute to worry about. You couldn't commute if you wanted to. You might as well relax. Or it's so hard you don't get to see your extended family and your friends, so you deserve it. Indulge a little more. It's so easy to buy into all that, but that's not where spiritual growth really comes in. It's not where spiritual growth comes from. I read an article years ago that really stuck with me about these women's groups that would do mall walking or jogging, and they weren't succeeding in losing weight. And so they started to study this more. And what they found is that they would like walk around the mall, and then they would feel like they'd really done a lot in terms of exercise. And then so they'd go to the food court and treat themselves. And so they'd get like a 600-pound muffin, 600-calorie muffin. And they would have burnt like 50 calories. And then they reward themselves with 600. And it's like, you would have been literally better staying home and not going to exercise, because the way you rewarded yourself more than offset, like 12 times offset all the hard work you've done. And so I think the risk is we can view the coronavirus and the quarantine as kind of like the mall walk, where we say, oh, you know, well, I stayed in, so I might as well treat myself to some ice cream. I'm already, you know, gonna be around the house, might as well put a movie on. That mentality is so easy to fall into. I'm not immune from it. I mean, the ice cream and the movie are examples from my own life. So I'm not just like pointing a finger at like mall walkers. I'm saying like all of us can fall into that trap, but that's not where our sanctity lies.
Yes. So Joe, is it, I have my own answer, but is it easier to add something that we don't currently do, like a spiritual practice, like, you know, reading or praying for half an hour a day or whatever? Or is it not easier? Is it tougher to do that? Or is it tougher to, you know, abstain from food or abstain from sleep, or what? Like, is there an answer to the kind of the Christian tradition of what they tend to go towards?
There's a really cool answer in the Christian tradition as to what we tend to go towards. And I discovered this a few years ago, and I've never really been good about putting it in practice, but I kind of aspire to do this, where they would offset giving something up by adding something. So on fast days, they would take the money they were going to spend on food and they give it to the poor. And what I love about it is twofold. One is you are both like adding and taking something away, but you're also making sure that your motives for fasting are selfless. It'd be easy to fast because you want to like save money. It'd be easy to fast because you want to like not waste the calories. And so instead, if you're giving the money to the poor, it purifies the fast. So I think in my own life, I tend to find it easier to give things up than to add things, because I tend to find myself short on time, even in the midst of quarantine somehow. And I find it harder, you know, to add stuff. But it probably differs by person and by what it is you're giving up. What about you? What do you find easier?
I'm kind of like you. Well, so it's interesting. I find adding something much harder. Gosh, it's both and. I mean, when you start changing a diet or fasting to one meal a day, or getting up at a certain time every single day when you went to bed late, or your kid is crying out at 3 a.m. and you still want to get up, like that's brutal. That's tough. But the same thing is true of, hey, if I want to start adding, you know, prayer time to my day, that means I'm sacrificing something.
Yeah.
And so I think at the end of the day, is it a sacrifice? Is it a disruption to your normal rhythm? And if it truly is, then it's probably truly difficult. you know. But I found that in both cases, whether it's adding something or getting rid of something or giving up something, it's hard.
Yeah,
My flesh wants to be satiated, period.
yeah.
And it's hard.
I like the idea, and you mentioned this last week. When you are giving up something, the temptation is just like to be a Spartan about it, to kind of white knuckle your way through, and then to like get grouchy with everybody around you. And what we're called to do
Right.
is like recognize our own weakness in those moments, and then have those be times where we like turn everything over to Christ. And so like every time you're like craving the food, you remember for whose sake uh, you're not eating it. And like that way, even when you're giving something up, you're really also adding something. You're adding more awareness of God. You're adding more prayer, because otherwise you can give up all sorts of stuff. Like you can live a really radical ascetical life without being particularly close to Christ. But you can't live a life deeply of prayer and almsgiving and be close to Christ. I mean, and not be close to Christ. Like, you know what I mean? So the adding stuff in some ways is where it is. Like that's where the real growth happens. But to add that, you usually need to take away all the things that are impediments to your spiritual growth. Now, normally we end man morning by having small group questions. Now, obviously, small groups are going to be pretty difficult to do with this format. But I wanted to tee up a few questions just to think about. And the first are, and it's very much related to what we just were talking about. The first one are, what are the distractions in my life, and what are the things that I'm taking for granted? And they may be not just things, they may be people. So in his address on Friday, Pope Francis talked about all of the people we take for granted every day, the healthcare workers, the police officers, the supermarket employees, that this current coronavirus thing has revealed to us how many people in our life we count on just to like have everything we need just for our daily existence. So where am I basically ungrateful, and where am I distracting myself from what I'm meant to be? So give thanks to God for the people you've been ungrateful for, the things you've been ungrateful for, things like Mass or being able to come together, etc. Cultivate a disposition of gratitude and combat those distractions. So then the next thing would be basically, in this next 2-week stretch, how can I set aside anything encumbering me from moving towards Christ? And or what do I need to add to ensure that I have the best Lent I can have? Any final thoughts before we close in a prayer, Chad?
Nope, I believe it was well said. So thank you, Joe.
Absolutely. Okay, let's close in a prayer then. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord Jesus, we thank you for this Lent. We thank you that you have been with us in these times of trials. We ask that you guide us through them, that these can be times of great flourishing for your kingdom, that they can lead souls to you, that they can rouse the lukewarm and the sleeping and the slothful, that we can all become more fully Christian today. We can become more fully in love with you today. And we ask that you be with us and guide us in how we can live out prayer, fasting, and almsgiving in a particular way over these next 2 weeks. In the name of the Father, and Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks a lot. We'll see everyone next week.